There is a stretch of water somewhere near you that gets fished about 500 times a season, and almost every one of those 500 people makes the same trade without noticing they made it. They trade feedback for options. Something is not working, so they change the lure. Then the color, then the line, then the spot. 4 hours later they have made 40 decisions and learned nothing from any of them, because they never held one thing still long enough for the water to answer. The people who taught most of us to fish did not have that escape hatch. One rod, one box. If a decision was wrong, nothing in the boat was going to rescue it. So they got very good at the only thing left, reading what the water gave back. 15 of those habits, in the order a fishing day actually happens. Some sound too small to matter, and those are the ones people skip. 2 or 3 sound like the opposite of what you have been told, and I will show you when they are and when they are not. None of it costs money. Let's go down to the water. It is early. The lake has that flat pewter look it only holds for about an hour, and you have not tied anything on yet. Good, because the first thing worth doing is looking for birds. Not any bird. 2 of them. The great blue heron out in the shallows is not telling you where fish are, it is telling you where a depth is. That bird can only work water it can stand in, so wherever it stands, it is drawing you a contour line from dry ground. The kingfisher is a different instrument. Belted kingfishers hunt fish that live shallow or swim near the top, and most of what they catch comes from less than 2 feet under the surface. They also need to see. Clear water and an unobstructed view are essential to them, and they will abandon a stretch they have used for years when heavy rain muddies it up. So a kingfisher on a branch hands you 2 things at once. There is bait in the top 2 feet under that limb, and the water there is still clean enough to hunt by eye. Geese tell you nothing, and cormorants work water 40 feet deep, so they sit over places you cannot reach. Spend a minute on the 2 that matter before you tie on. And remember where the heron stood, because at first light tomorrow it will not be there yet. You can be. Now walk to the edge and put your hand in the water. Then walk 100 yards and do it again. Then once more, somewhere different. Your hand is a terrible thermometer and an excellent comparator. You will never guess the number, but you feel the difference between 3 places instantly, and the difference is what matters. A lake does not have a temperature, it has temperatures. The shallow bay catching sun off dark bottom, the creek mouth pushing cooler water in, the windward corner stirred all night. In early spring, a few degrees between those 3 moves, whole populations of fish before anything else changes. The nuance is direction. In April, warmer is where you want to be. By late July, that same bay is the last place a good fish wants to sit, and the cool inflow becomes the address. Same habit, opposite reading. 3 touches, 30 seconds, and the lake is sorted into places worth walking to and places worth walking past. There is something else out there this morning, and if there is any breeze, you have seen it 100 times without asking what it was. Those long parallel streaks of foam and pollen and bits of leaf running with the wind. In 1938, Irving Langmuir published work on exactly this, built on experiments he ran on Lake George in New York. Wind and waves together do not just push the surface along. They organize the water underneath into long counter-rotating rolls lying parallel to the wind. Where 2 rolls meet, the surface sinks. Anything floating cannot sink with it, so it gets swept sideways and gathered into a line. That streak is not litter. It is the visible seam of a downwelling. And the same current that gathered the foam has been gathering everything else that drifts. Here is where the advantage gets thrown away. Almost everyone casts across it, and a bait fired perpendicular spends about 2 seconds in the part that matters. Stand at one end and fish along it. When the wind swings, the seam swings with it. 3 places worth walking to, which raises a question people almost never ask, and it costs them fish before the first cast. Which direction are you going to walk? Anyone who grew up on streams had this drilled into them. You work upstream. The reason usually given is that it keeps the mud you kick up behind you, which is true, and is the smaller half of it. Fish holding in current face into it. That is how they breathe, and how their food arrives. Walking upstream means approaching every fish in the place from behind. And here is the part that transfers. On a windy day, a lake has current too, slower and messier, but the water is moving, and fish sitting in it tend to face the push. So take 10 seconds before you start walking. On a still day, it hardly matters. With a steady wind pressing one shore, it is the difference between fish that hold and fish that slide out ahead of you the whole way. And while we walk, let's deal with the advice that gets whispered more than any other and gets it almost exactly backwards. Keep your voice down. Don't talk. You'll scare them. Meanwhile, the old hands I have watched would carry on a full conversation across a boat all morning and go rigid if you dropped a pair of pliers on the deck. That is not inconsistency. It is precise observation, and the physics is not complicated. Air and water are wildly mismatched as sound carriers. The impedance ratio between them is roughly 1 to 3,600, so when a sound in air hits the surface, something like 99.9% of that energy bounces straight back off. Your voice is getting reflected at the ceiling. But a boot on a hull, a tray dropped on aluminum, an anchor set down hard, a heel on a hollow bank, none of that has to cross the surface at all. It goes into the boat or into the ground and straight into the water with nothing in the way. The common habit is to whisper on the bank while wearing hard soles and slamming a lid. Exactly the wrong two things. So talk. Put a towel on the floor of the boat, wear soft soles, and set the box down instead of dropping it. The honest limit, how much any species reacts on a given day, is not something anyone has nailed down. What is nailed down is which channel gets through. 200 yards on, there is a line running through the water. It rained hard 2 nights ago. Where the creek comes in, the water has gone the color of coffee with too much milk in it. Off to the left it is stained, but you can still see a foot down. Everybody has been told to fish the mud line. The advice is right. The reason usually given for it is wrong, and the wrong reason makes people fish it badly. The common story is that predators sit inside the dirty water and ambush out of it. That is not what the work says. Turbidity has been shown over and over to shorten the distance at which a fish hunting by sight can detect anything, and studies on visual predators generally find their feeding gets worse in dirty water, not better. So flip it. The mud line is not a fortress. It is a gradient. Just outside it, a fish can still see a long way. Just inside, it can barely see past its own nose. That changes where you throw. Most people fire into the muddiest water they can find, which is the one place a fish is least likely to ever see the bait. Fish the clear side, tight to the seam, running parallel to it, or nick into the edge and come back out. And if you do go inside the stain, the bait's job changes. It has to be found from close, slower, tighter, wider profile, more thump. Not brighter, closer. You put a cast on the clear side of that seam, let it swing, and halfway back the rod loads up. A good fish, not the fish of the year. You land it, sit it back in the water, watch it go. Now what did you just learn? Most of us answer with a place. There was a laydown there, so we go and find the next laydown, and we can lose an afternoon doing it. The old habit was to note the depth first, not the cover. Because cover is an address, and depth is a pattern. That fish did not choose a stick, it chose a set of conditions, and the stick happened to be sitting in them. Light, temperature, oxygen, where the bait is holding. Those sort themselves out vertically, across the whole lake at once. So a fish at 6 feet is not telling you about that laydown. It is telling you about 6 feet, including 6 feet on a bare bank 300 yards away, where nobody stops because there is nothing pretty to cast at. The nuance, and I will not oversell it, this holds up better in stable weather and through the middle of the day than during a spawn or right after a front. A starting hypothesis, not a rule. Next bite you get, ask one number before you cast again. How deep? Then go find that number somewhere ugly. Which brings us to what you do with your time. And here the old approach beats the modern one plainly enough to be uncomfortable. The modern instinct is to find the best spot on the lake and stay on it. The old habit was to run 3 spots and rotate, all day. That looks like impatience. It is somebody who understood that a spot has a half-life. Every cast changes that water, the line hitting the surface, The fish you fought right through the middle of the school, the one that came off and swam back in there spooked. By your 15th cast, you are not fishing that spot anymore. You are fishing water that knows it is being fished. So the angler rotating 3 spots is not getting 1 first cast a day, they are getting 6 or 9. And a first cast into rested water is worth more than the 30th cast into the best water on the lake. The mistake is rotating too far. 3 spots 20 minutes apart is a road trip. Pick 3 within a few minutes of each other, 10 minutes each, and do not hunt for a 4th until you have been round twice. On the second lap, something useful usually happens. The spot that was dead at 8 gives you a fish at 9, and now you know something about time that standing still could never have taught you. Say you have found them, right depth, rested spot, and followers without commitment. This is where a modern angler reaches into the box, and an old-school angler reaches for the split shot. The habit was to fish the lightest weight conditions allowed, not for sensitivity, for fall rate. Because a lot of what we call the bait being too big is not a size problem. It is a vertical speed problem. The same lure dropping at half the rate hangs at eye level instead of falling past, and looks less like something pulled by a string. Almost nobody tries that first. They downsize 3 times while the weight stays exactly where it was. This one deserves a small update, and it is a place modern tackle genuinely helps. The habit formed on thick monofilament that resisted the lure and demanded weight. With thin braid or a light fluorocarbon leader, you can go lighter than your grandfather ever could and still keep contact. The rule did not change, the floor under it dropped. Take a shot off before you take a size down. While that bait is falling, something is happening you probably cannot picture. Once you can, you will understand 10 years of missed dockfish. Cast to a piling. Let it sink on a tight line. Where does it land? Not at the base of the piling. On a tight line, the lure is on the end of a string with your rod tip as the pivot, so it does not fall straight down. It swings. It pendulums back toward you the whole way down and lands several feet out in open water. You have been aiming at cover your entire life and landing beside it. The old habit is to feed line on the drop, which is right, and then people take it too far. Bail open, huge loop, nothing to read. And the drop is where an enormous number of bites happen. Do it in stages. Pull an arm's length of slack off, watch the line, pull another. The lure falls much closer to vertical, and you can still read it. That soft tick, or the moment the line goes slack half a second early, is a fish. It is not the bottom. Now the retrieve, and this habit came from a limitation. Old reels were poor at bringing line in, so people moved the bait with the rod and used the reel mostly to pick up what the rod had gained. That limitation was a gift. A reel handle turned at any speed produces a constant one, and nothing living down there moves at a constant speed. Everything reel accelerates, coasts, turns, stalls. A rod sweep does that on its own, because your arm is not a machine, and because the bait keeps traveling for a moment after the sweep ends and then settles. The pause is the whole thing. Watch anyone catch fish on a jerkbait or a jig and count when the bites come. They come on the stop, over and over. The way people botch it is subtle. They start reeling while they are still sweeping, which cancels the pause and turns it back into a steady drag with a wobble in it. Sweep, stop, gather the slack while the bait sits, then sweep again. Let the bait finish its sentence before you start the next one. Which brings us to the moment that empties tackle boxes faster than any other. A fish comes up behind the bait, maybe just a wake, maybe a shadow that materializes 6 feet out, paces your lure like it is inspecting a used car, and turns away. What is the advice you have heard your entire life for that? Slow down. Give it time. Let it look. For a fish that has already followed your bait to your feet, that is often exactly wrong, and I think it is the most expensive common advice on the water. Think about what that animal is doing. It is not undecided about being hungry. It came. It committed distance. It is running one last check, and what it is checking is whether the thing in front of it is behaving like food. There is one behavior no real prey animal ever gets wrong. When it realizes it has been seen, it leaves. A bait that slows as a predator closes is doing something nothing alive has ever done. A bait that accelerates, or veers, or bolts off at an angle, ends the inspection. It stops being a question and becomes a chase. Now let me draw the line properly, because speeding up on every follower is not what I am saying. Accelerate when the water is warm, when the fish came in fast and hot, when it is a reaction species like a pike or a smallmouth, and when the follow happened late in the retrieve. Those are chase conditions. Slow down or stop dead when the water is cold, when the fish drifted up slowly and hung there, when it is pressured water where everything gets thrown at them, and when they are picking at things rather than hunting them. Those are inspection conditions, and speed only removes the bait from a fish that was never going to sprint. The tell is in the approach, not the refusal. Fast in, fast out. Slow in, slow down. And there is a free version of acceleration that works whether you read it right or not. Run the bait into something. A stump, a rock, a dock post, the bottom. A deflection is an involuntary direction change, and more convincing than anything your hands can fake, because it is not a rhythm, it is an accident. The mistake, and nearly everybody makes it, is stopping when you feel the contact. That is the moment. Do not pull it out of there. So you do it. The bait ticks the corner of a dock post, kicks sideways, and the line goes heavy. Now the part nobody films. Getting bitten is roughly the middle of the job, not the end of it. The old rule for any bite you can see was, do not set the hook on what you see, set it on what you feel. Your eye is faster than the fish's mouth. That boil where your frog was is very often the approach, not the fish having the bait. On a blow-up, a good share of the time the fish missed, or turned across it, or has it sideways. Swing at the sight, and you take the bait away from a fish that was about to get it. The old fix is almost comically low-tech. Say a word in your head first. 1 word for a treble bait, 2 for a big single hook. Then load up when you feel weight. And here is another rule that needs translating, because the tackle under it changed completely. Set it hard was written for stretchy monofilament and soft glass rods, where a violent swing was the only way to get force to the hook. Run that same swing on braid and a stiff graphite rod and you are tearing the hole open. Same words, very different result. Circle hooks flip it entirely. There the correct hook set is no set at all, and a hard swing pulls the hook back out. Feel it, then load it. Do not swing at a splash. And now the part I want you to sit with. The line is heavy. The rod is bent in a way it has not been all day. Everything you did this morning worked. The right bank, the depth, the rested spot, the fall. The fish told you it believed you. And this one is bigger than the fish you caught earlier. You can feel that in about 1.5 seconds. So here is the uncomfortable arithmetic. 5 hours of decisions, and the next 3 seconds can undo every one of them. This is where experience shows up most and gets talked about least. 3 habits, all small. The first happens before the cast. Old hands pick the landing spot before they threw. Not once the fish was on. Before. Because after a big fish is hooked, every option is a bad one, and you end up walking backwards along a bank you never looked at, dragging a fish across riprap. Look at where you are standing and ask, if the biggest fish here eats this cast, where do I bring it in? If there is no answer, move your feet, not your lure. The second is your legs. If the fish runs straight at you, and they do, a reel cannot recover line as fast as a fish can swim. Nobody's can. But you can walk. Back up the bank smoothly and keep the line tight with your whole body while the reel catches up. It looks like panic, and it is the calmest thing available to you. The third one I would put on a sticker. When the fish comes out of the water, drop your rod tip toward it. The old phrase is bow to the fish, and it sounds like manners. It is not. A fish in the air with a tight line has something to push against, and the hard head of a jumping fish, plus a lure with weight in it, makes a very effective lever for throwing a hook. Give it slack for that half second and there is nothing to lever against. That is mechanical reasoning and long practice rather than a controlled study, and I will call it that. The mistake is doing it halfway. People drop the tip and crank furiously at the same time, which is just a tight line at a different angle. Drop it, Let the jump finish, then come back on it. And then the fish is in your hand, and it is heavy, and you sit there a second longer than you need to. Hook out with wet hands, keep it in the water while you find the camera instead of after, and let it go. And before any of it, know your rules. Seasons, size and harvest limits, gear restrictions, bait rules, and where you are allowed to stand all vary by state and often by the individual lake. Check your state and local regulations before you fish. It is late now. The light has gone that flat orange that makes everything look further away than it is, and there are rings out past the point you do not have time to check. So, the last one. The one that makes the other 14 worth anything. The people who taught most of us to fish fished the same water for 20 years. Usually not the best water. Usually just the closest. For a long time I thought that was a limitation they put up with. I have come around to thinking it was the reason they were good. Because everything here is not 15 tips. It is 15 questions you can put to a body of water. Which depth? Which side of the seam? Which way the fish are facing? Whether a follower wants speed or stillness. And a question is not knowledge until the same water has answered it twice. The first answer is a coincidence. The second one is a pattern. They were not smarter than us. They just had no way around that loop. No second lake 2 hours away, no new rod to blame. When something did not work, the only thing left to change was their understanding of the place. So that is what changed. And this is not a complaint about modern gear. Modern gear is wonderful. A good rod today outperforms anything those people ever held, and I will not romanticize a glass pole and a reel that ate line. The gear is not the problem. It is only that gear cannot do the 4 things this whole video has been about. It cannot notice for you, it cannot compare for you, it cannot remember for you, and it cannot learn for you. Those 4 are still yours, exactly as they were in 1950. All the old habits do is put you somewhere you have to use them. So, one small thing for the next trip. Not 15. 1. Pick the least impressive water near your house. The ugly pond, the stretch of river with the bad parking. Go 4 times this season and take exactly 1 question from this list with you each time. Just 1. Let the water answer it twice. 4 visits, 4 questions, and you will know more about that place than about any lake you have driven 3 hours to reach. That is the trade going the other way. Not 40 decisions and nothing learned. 4 decisions. And something you keep. Now I want to hear from you, and I want the disagreement more than the agreement. The one I expect to split the room is the follower. When a fish comes up behind your bait and turns off, do you speed it up or kill it dead? I have watched good anglers argue about this at boat ramps, and both sides catch fish. So tell me which camp you are in, what species, and what the water temperature was doing when you learned it. And the second one, because I think it is the most underrated thing here. Have you ever gone back to a spot you burned earlier in the day, an hour or 2 later, and had it be a completely different place? I think the people who fish one small water know something about that the rest of us keep paying to learn.